Vanessa. Happy almost end of 2023.
Woohoo! Happy almost end of 2023. I feel like we should say happy almost 2024, but I'm actually more excited for the year to be over than for the new year to begin. So yay! Happy almost end of 2023 to you and to you listeners out there, our Urban Roots listeners. Happy almost holidays.
And in case you've forgotten, because it's been so long, we are Urban Roots, the podcast from Urbanist Media that unearths little-known stories from history.
Yep, we are on a mission to preserve marginalized places through story. And just to refresh you, in case it's been a minute and you've forgotten who we are, my lovely co-host Deqah Hussein-Wetzel is a historic preservationist who works primarily on African American history. And I'm Vanessa Quirk. I am a journalist focused on cities and inclusive development.
Mm-hmm. And actually, I should tell him, and I'm on my way to becoming an expert because I'm in my PhD program right now at Columbia.
Deqah, you're not on your way. You already are an expert. Just Columbia is just cottoned on to the fact that you're an expert.
That's true. That's true. It's already realized that I'm so great that
already realized. They're just giving you a piece of paper to show other people
the platform to get the dissertation out there, to be able to get that book out there, right? So
yes.
Anyway, yeah. We generally, as a podcast here, do narrative documentary style episodes, but between seasons, we like to release bonus episodes.
Mm-hmm. Yep. In these bonus episodes, we interview leaders in preservation and development who are just thinking really deeply about how we can center marginalized groups and hopefully offset the historic inequities that have been built into our cities.
Yeah, it's been a hot minute since our last bonus episode, mostly because we've been pretty hard at work on our next narrative series about the lost city of Vanport, which you can all check that out with the trailer that we posted in our feeds and on YouTube, if you haven't already.
Yep, I'm very excited about that series. It's going to be awesome. But in the meantime, we did want to get out one last interview onto your feeds before the end of the year. But I guess before we get to our awesome guest, we have some housekeeping.
Yes. It sounds boring, but it's actually pretty exciting.
I guess. So 2 things of housekeeping. Item number 1, it is the time of year, everybody, when you give to all of your favorite nonprofits to help them do the awesome work they do. And we at Urbanist Media are no exception.
That's right. As a reminder, Urbanist Media is our 501c3 nonprofit, and our mission is to elevate underrepresented voices and preserve the places significant to them.
Mm-hmm. And beyond the podcast, we do a lot of other things, actually. We create educational resources highlighting women, people of color, LGBTQ plus folks.
Yeah, we've published activity books for kids on African American history. We've made a documentary on urban renewal in Cincinnati, and even helped get a super important African American building in Cincinnati's West End neighborhood, the Regal Theater, listed on the National Register of Historic Places.
Yes, super cool, that project.
And it's crazy because I'm also now working on the historic tax credit project for that building, which is just one more step towards an economically viable rehab and building that's going to be amazing. It's going to be turned into hopefully an art education center. It's going to be great. So we're just super excited about all the stuff that we're doing.
Yes, for sure. Another thing that we did this year that I thought was super cool is we actually partnered with Cincinnati Public Radio, and we produced these short radio pieces for WVXU. We did one on the Regal Theater, which was really great, and then some others on other significant African American people and places in Cincy history. So we did one on Sarah Fawcett, another on Marion Spencer, and one on Union Baptist Cemetery, which was super fun.
Our Urbanist Media members, Queens of Queen City, also contributed to the effort, helping us produce a short about Black trans artists who performed at Cincinnati's Cotton Club back in the day.
Right. That was super cool.
Yeah. Then they continue, Queens of Queen City, to publish numerous blog articles and give many fascinating lectures about little-known women and LGBTQ figures of Cincinnati history throughout the year. That's something they always do. So they're so great.
Yeah. And if you've been following us on Instagram on Urban Roots Culture, we've been kind of posting a little bit more of their work this year. So you can kind of get more of a glimpse of our Queens of Queen City friends there. Yeah. But the thing is, all of these lovely things we do, we want to keep doing them next year. So we've actually started a fundraising campaign. We launched it on Giving Tuesday, and we are trying to raise $5,000 from our supporters by the end of the year.
Yeah, and we could really, really use your help to get to the finish line. We are just a quarter of the way to our goal, and we just kind of need that oomph, that push, right, to get us over. So not trying to bleed you all dry, but we are trying to graciously ask for your kind donations. And honestly, thank you as well to all the people who've already donated to our campaign.
Yes, we so appreciate you all. You're helping us make a big difference already. And I do want to take a second to shout out our top donors. So that is Kimberly Burnett, Karen Zabarski-Blaszek, Aaron Smith, DeFay Chen, Donna Deaton, Chase Ricky. Thank you all so very much. So if you want to be one of those awesome people who have helped us out to help preserve histories and communities of marginalized groups, then please go to our GoFundMe link in our episode notes. I think it's gofundme.com/urbanistmedia.
Ooh, yeah. And if giving money isn't in the cards for you this year, we totally get it. There is actually another way you can help us out this December.
That is right. Okay, so on to housekeeping item number 2, which is maybe even more exciting, although getting money is an exciting thing, but even more exciting. I'm very happy to announce a finalist in the Anthem Awards.
This is a big deal.
How cool is that? Yes. Okay, Deqah, if somebody doesn't know, can you please explain what the heck the Anthem Awards are?
Right. So Anthem Awards are brought by the Webby Awards, and they honor the purpose and mission-driven work of people, companies, and organizations worldwide.
Right. We are finalists in their DEI category, so we're automatically entered into their People's Choice Award type thing. It's called the Anthem Community Voice Award, and that means we need your votes. So if you like this little podcast and you don't have money to give, but you want to help us in another way, please go to the website, click Celebrate, and that would really help us to getting some recognition for this little pod of ours.
Yes, and we'll also put that in our episode notes for you.
Yes, and just a quick note that the voting does end December 21st, so not too much time left for that. But yeah, I would appreciate you all giving us a vote.
Okay, well, I think that we now have all the housekeeping out of the way.
Whew.
Shall we get to our excellent guest?
I think we should. Let's do it.
Cool. So today we have the lovely and talented Zahra Ebrahim.
Zahra is the co-founder of Monumental, which is a social purpose business working to advance equitable city building and urban development.
And I particularly love how Zahra and her team put the development and success of BIPOC leaders at the center of their practice. Earlier this year, she helped start a BIPOC real estate development incubator for folks in Toronto, which I think is pretty badass.
Yeah, I love that project. She also does some other cool things apart from leading Monumental. She's an urbanist in residence at the University of Toronto's School of Cities, which is also very cool.
Yeah, and she's been recognized as a Next City Vanguard civic leader and as one of the Urban Land Institute's WLI champions.
Right, but I do think we should mention, Deqah, one of her most amazing accomplishments, which is her rocking collection of neon clothes, which I luckily got to witness when I went up to Toronto this summer. So yes, Zahra, well done.
Yeah, I agree.
On your neon.
Well, I think this intro was long enough, and we shall get to our interview with Zahra Ebrahim. Please enjoy this conversation. Assalamu alaikum, Zahra. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. All right. So, assalamu alaikum, Mambo. So, for our first question, it's pretty simple. But I did listen to your TEDx, so I do recognize the importance of not sticking too hard on labels. But who are you, and what do you do?
Well, my name is Zahra Ebrahim. I am the co-founder of Monumental Projects, which is a social purpose business in Toronto that helps civic institutions like developers and municipalities and quasi-government organizations help work with communities to develop shared decision-making models and build strategies and programs and policies and sometimes even buildings and neighborhoods together.
And you do that with your company today?
I do that with my company today. I have a thesis around my work, which is about trying to share power from some to many. And in today's world, power often means different types of capital. So social capital, knowing people, financial capital, having money, intellectual capital, having the knowledge of how to do things. And so my thesis sort of in my life's work is really about being one of the many people who support sort of power sharing between, moving from only a few people having power to many. And so I also wear a hat as urbanist in residence at the University of Toronto School of Cities. as a community organizer, doing both mutual aid and place-based work in my own neighborhood and neighborhoods across the city, and really trying to support organizations who are bringing different aspects of this sort of thesis of power sharing to life in whatever ways I can.
If you could describe your background and upbringing a little bit, what did you study in school to lead you to this?
Well, I mean, like many people, I stumbled into this work. Like, this was not, in fact, I think 10-year-old Zahra, I was just reading her dreams, and the other day she drew a picture and said what she was going to do at 35. She was going to read books and organize her files, and I think she was a lawyer, but I think she thought that lawyers got to read books and organize things. So she was like, that's what I want to do. I don't think she actually wanted to be a lawyer. I know she didn't. So I stumbled across this like many people do. I started school thinking I would do international development. Then I thought I'd do business. 4 or 5 majors later, I found myself sitting in a class called Site Usage, and it totally changed my life because it was an architecture prof talking about how people took the outdoor space that they had access to, a window, a front yard, front porch, whatever it was, and did wild things to express who they were, whether painted wild colors, or in Toronto we have a few homes that are like covered in dolls. And he showed this image of someone who had made a tiny replica of the Montreal Olympic Stadium and put it in the middle of a perfectly manicured, huge front lawn. And that was their way of expressing who they were. And I thought the whole concept of this, I couldn't believe this was work. So I switched as many programs as I could to try and figure out, how does one get to study this kind of thing? So there was a mix of this sort of urban systems and then also trying to take as much architecture as I possibly could because I really started to fall in love with design. When I finished school, I was going out and interviewing for jobs at planning and architecture firms, non-credentialed, but, well-educated from a school in Canada. And, wanted to talk about the thing that I was most curious about, which is like, how do you figure out what to build? Right? And I'm just talking to all of these different firms and like, oh, we do site surveys and we do demographic research. I'm like, no. Like, how, what are those conversations like? And no one had a good answer. And so before it was like in vogue to start your own organization, this is like, to be 21 and start your own organization. When it was definitely a bad career move or thought of as a bad career move, I started this like, architecture think tank, the city building organization that was specifically focused on helping communities inform the infrastructure developments that were coming into their neighborhoods. It was an idea that was before its time, but those who understood it. And it was a really great place because it was not this like we didn't exist in this paradigm of like being more community informed, being more community centered. And so I operated a little bit at the margins of how city building and urbanism and the built environment got developed, building out a set of projects that could demonstrate that community-based design projects make generational tectonic shifts in our city and that change the course of social cohesion. They change the course of sort of health outcomes, mental health outcomes, economic outcomes, and ultimately sort of just build nicer, better communities. So I did that work for about 10 years. And then there was it was sort of a strange turn, but I was also really curious about all of these private sector organizations that invest in communities. And I didn't really understand big levels of government and sort of big institutions. And so Deloitte had acquired a design firm based out of Chicago called Doblin, and they wanted to scale it in Canada. And so I had the opportunity to sort of go from a very community-based practice to sort of the belly of a multi-billion-dollar beast and build a values-centered organization looking to engage people in the design of programs and policies and strategies within Deloitte. So I did that for about 5 years. And on the other side of that, I reconnected with a colleague I had met along the way who is a brilliant, thoughtful Rhodes Scholar who had studied sort of the idea around East-West solidarity. So how in North America, sort of Canada and America worked in the global South, and what's the difference sort of between charity and solidarity, and how do we look at what foreign aid did and didn't do. And we had met along the way when I was running my social enterprise, and we had both left leadership roles, and really started to realize that his experience in sort of academia and community-based work together with my experience in sort of design, urbanism, and community-based work there was something there, and that so many racialized leaders go off and build their own fiefdoms, and it's really time for us to sort of share our power and see what happens when we co-lead together. So that's the collectivist mindset. That's where we live.
So I was wondering if you could describe your upbringing a little bit. Did you grow up in Canada?
I did. I mean, my family immigrated to Canada in the early 80s. So I was born in Nairobi, and my parents were born in East Africa, and we came over in the early 80s when East Africa wasn't a safe place for Muslims to be, and Canada was a really friendly and welcoming place for our specific community. And so we moved when I was probably one, or just around 1 year old, and I grew up in Vancouver. And then moved to Montreal for school and eventually landed in Toronto. And actually a large part of what enables me to do the kind of interstitial work I do, which is like working in between professions, in between institutions, in between community and institutions, is I think in large part enabled by the Canadian context, but very specifically by the Toronto context.
Can you explain that a little bit more? Like, what is it about the Toronto context that lends itself to interstitial work?
Well, when I started out, when I finished my undergraduate degree, and I was a non-professional like urbanist, so I didn't have a planning or an architecture degree, but wanted to work specifically in infrastructure. Like I wanted to impact the way in which community-based infrastructure was built. In Vancouver, the domain of city building at the time, and this is 20 years ago, was really squarely for people with credentials. And so if you weren't, then you were a community member who wanted to be part of an engagement process. Things have since changed, of course. That was 20 years ago, and the climate everywhere was a little bit different. But I came to Toronto for a visit and was talking about these ideas. Fresh out of school, I had this idea of starting an organization that kind of worked in between communities and institutions and helped communities shape outcomes that, municipalities weren't wanting to also see. But to do it in a way that was really of the place they lived. And so I came to Toronto for a visit, and I remember meeting all these people, and I was sort of trying to explain what was a very half-baked idea of participatory design and, human-centered design and human rights. And I was, there was a soup of ideas. And what I found was in Toronto, there was a more welcoming climate for things that sort of exist, that colored outside of the lines. And so it wasn't that people were like, we get it, we're on board. They were like, tell me more. Does this fit? And I found that the folks I met would be throwing stuff at the wall, like, here's a project I'm working on. Does this kind of fit what you're talking about? Until something actually, so people kept doing that until something actually stuck. And there was the right opportunity to test out some of these ideas around how do communities most barriered from, so many opportunities drive the decision-making around, all the things that show up in their neighborhoods. So Toronto was a more welcoming place at the time.
Right. Okay, so just really quickly, I want to just go back and ask, because you were saying your parents were born in East Africa, but they had come, their families had come from other places. Where is that other place? Where's that original ethnic background?
Yeah, I mean, we are from the Ismaili community, which is a particular sect of the Islamic community that has been sort of perennially diasporic. So we have always moved because I think there's a variety of different reasons. Maybe a version you could say is that Ismailis have had a more contemporary interpretation of the Quran. And so, since Ismailis have existed, we have been diasporic. So it's hard to answer that question. We know that there are roots in Gujarat in India, probably the most recent, but we also know that our ancestry sort of touches other places in the Middle East, and even Moorish parts of Europe. And so that's actually part of, my own journey right now is finding those pathways, right? Because so many of those stories get lost. But a perennially sort of diasporic community that, in the early 80s when many folks had settled for generations in East Africa until the early 80s in Tanzania and Uganda and Kenya. And then sort of there was this purge of Muslims out of East Africa, and sort of they went many places, but Canada and the UK were the predominant places where our communities ended up So I spent my formative years in Vancouver, but with deep connections to the continent.
Yeah. And so, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting background, especially with the kind of work that you do. I mean, how does that background perspective, those stories that you might have been brought up with, how does that influence your definition of community and place? Because I feel like in a lot of situations, you might imagine that like community is deeply rooted in place, but it's not always true, right? People move, people form communities as they've moved, and there is interrelation, but they don't necessarily always have to be tied. So I'm just curious if you've thought about that, what it means to have community in place, and what is quote unquote permanent and what can change and evolve.
You know, someone a few years ago, a colleague I worked with, described herself as a third culture kid, having moved many times over the course of her life. And so feeling like there were many places in her that had that held meaning and shaped her identity, but yet she was not of any of those places, or she wouldn't describe herself as of any of those places. You know, it's interesting, like I'm a bit of that in some ways, where you know, part of what I admire about my parents and how they adapted to living in the Canadian context after growing up in Kenya and having sort of a range of different influences themselves from the generations that came from India and other places, trying to adapt in the Kenyan and the East African context, was that they found ways of bringing in rituals and behaviors and practices that were of, you know, one version of Canada, and that's a complicated story, but the version of Canada that we existed within as settlers. And so we adopted certain traditions in our life that are very meaningful to me, that are very, like, what you might say, like, of sort of a more Canadian cultural way of living. And so I think I'm constantly trying to put out tethers to find points of connection, right? So I think, you know, when I'm amongst, like, a lot of my work, Toronto, many people say, is the most diverse city on the planet. And so, you know, in my work, we connect to so many of the communities that I am of. And because my parents held so strongly onto all of our cultural identities, I feel connected to all of these folks, but wanting to respect that my experience is very different, right? Like, and that I don't represent those communities entirely either. So it's complex, right? And I think so much of this work is about, and I think we might have talked about this when we first met, was like understanding our own identities and understanding what they mean when we show up in these spaces to do place-based work. And how, even though I might think like, oh yeah, I do have Indian roots, like I can relate, my experience is very different, right? My experience is a few generations removed and lives in cultures and rituals. So it's complicated. It's complicated. It's a long way of saying it's complicated.
Right. No, I definitely get that being, you know, my family's got the Somali ethnic background, but my mom was also born in Kenya. And that's, well, she was born in Tanzania, but grew up in Kenya. And it's just all this East Africanness and this like Swahili-ness. And so I very much understand, like, identifying with that, but also recognizing that your family you might not feel like your family's directly from there. Although I do think there's a different layer to that with, you know, being a diasporic and having not exactly one particular route, right? Ties to one particular place. And I think that's a little bit more complex and could lead to I think ideas of wanting to make sure, you know, the community work that you do, I feel like I could see how that's inspired by understanding different perspectives.
Well, and I think it's possible to find belonging, right? Like, I think that's sort of the top line of all of this, whether, you know, I'm looking at my family's experiences or my own, and probably best just to speak for myself. But, you know, in many places I have found belonging, and it's disarmed me and surprised me. And so I think that's what I bring into this community work, is I think it's possible, right? Like, I think it's possible to feel a sense of belonging, feel a sense of connection, feel at home in your context, open-hearted, open-minded, to sort of all the difference that surrounds you, while also staying true to sort of who you are. Like, and I think that's part of what inspires this work, is like wanting to cultivate contexts where people can start to reflect on what it is they need to feel a sense of belonging. And I know lots of people talk about that, and there's so many different ways of getting to that. And so, my work is part of a kaleidoscope of, the work of many, like you two and so many others, the work of many.
So maybe let's get into a little bit this idea of community engagement and what the heck it means and how to do it. So maybe walk us through a little bit about, you mentioned earlier how when you were fresh out of college, you had ideas and people were throwing things on the wall and you were just trying to see what would stick. So maybe would you talk about how your approach to community engagement has evolved and what's stayed the same and what's changed over time?
I mean, I think, when I started out, I think I've been spending the last maybe 15 years trying to go back to the first 5 years of my career, the approaches of the first 5 years of my career. And I think my approach to community engagement there was, in the first year where I ever got to do anything that would be constituted as community engagement, it was at a time in Toronto where we had seen the highest incidences of gun violence in the city on record at that time. It was called the Summer of the Gun. And there was a lot of money pouring into communities and neighborhoods. And, one idea someone had said, maybe this is something you'd like to work on, was within one of those neighborhoods. So I was sort of dispatched out to do a community art project. And the thing that was such a big learning for me in that first year was the community art project turned into an infrastructure project. But I remember the executive director of the community-based organization I was supposed to partner with was like, I love your ideas, I love your passion, I love your energy, and I love your service. You're sort of like how you want to show up and serve. I'm also, people like you really freak me out. Like, you kind of see an opportunity and you want to harness everything you've learned and everything, all your values. You want to live at the level of your analysis. You want to live out your values and come and work in this community. And even though you have connections to some of the folks that, culturally that live here, you don't have the trust of the community, and folks like you come and go all the time. So if you want to earn the right to stay, just keep showing up. So what I did was, there was an opportunity to do a project, and for the first 6 months to a year, I would just go and bring my laptop and hang out at that community space. I wasn't working on anything. I was just meeting people and saying, hey, I'm Zahra, and it was, now in my work, I talk a lot about moving at the speed of trust, and that was it, right? It was I was moving slow because all I wanted was to earn the right to work in this community. And so I think that that was sort of a first principle for me, that now, having done engagement and knowing so many different ways of getting, designing contexts where people feel safe and they can speak in an open and vulnerable way, I can be guilty of not moving at the speed of trust too, right? And so some of those first principles around earning the right to people's lived experience, I think that kind of really holds true. I think I've gotten better at understanding my position in those spaces, acknowledging that, and that sort of engenders trust and facilitates it much more quickly by saying, I know I'm here representing an institution. Let me tell you a little bit about me. And I know that violates every code, research code, and that the researcher or the person facilitating is a third party actor that is neutral, which I just don't believe. I don't buy it. We're never neutral. And so I think part of the way in which, that formative experience really helped me understand that moving at the speed of trust helps you move really quickly when you're trying to do difficult things. And it can be facilitated in other ways. And so in my practice now, talking about who I am, what motivates me to be there, why I'm in the room, why me, I think that really has a big a material influence. I think the other thing too is that early in my career, I really showed up with just wanting to help, right? Wanting to say these people have given me some access to resources to, do this project. Is this interesting? How can I help? How can I, and really starting to starting by leading with inquiry. What do I not know? What do you need? What can I do? And I think leading with inquiry as you mature in your career also gets harder to do. Like, wrong is wrong. It kind of settles in. And so that principle for me is another one that I try to hang on to as tightly as possible.
Right. So how do you feel that you do all of like take those concepts and things that you've learned and package it so you're able to do the kind of community engagement work you want through monumental projects?
Yeah, and it's funny, people come to us to do community engagement work and we somehow find a way to reframe it to community dialogues, conversations.
Yeah, like the name, the term.
The term, right? It's like the term is also so, it's sullied because it's come to mean nothing to a lot of people. And so, our perspective on, so many institutions. So we often get institutions saying, we're thinking of opening a new building. We're thinking of, we're developing this area. We need to talk to the community. And so first we say the communities, because no one neighborhood is a single community. And then, what that looks like is we have to work with these organizations and institutions, and typically they're crown corporations. So in Canada, there's sort of quasi-government agencies, like our federal housing agency is an example of that. So they're accountable to government, but not part of government. We work with municipalities. We work with developers. We'll work with sort of larger national charities who are sort of working on projects of national significance. But in that sort of preliminary foundation setting, we're readying them to understand that we go deep with a few rather than broad with many to start. And that's always our starting point, which is, let's look at folks who have been most barriered from access to your kind of, so we're working with a post-secondary institution, we're working with a major cultural institution, we're working with a municipality running a specific program. Let's look at folks who have been most barriered and spend time in like very deep dialogue with a few. And so, let's say there's a population they're looking to engage, Tamil youth in this particular neighborhood. Maybe there's 10,000 of them. We're going to talk to 5 to 8. But we're going to spend like half a day with them and just go deep and have like real nuanced conversations. From there, we're going to learn some things, and then we're going to go see if those things actually exist for, the broader population. And that kind of work is really hard, because just convincing organizations that, you're trying to serve 200,000 people, but we're going to talk to like 16. And that's like a lot for us. That's really core.
I like to try to avoid the typical charrette and the what you, I think, maybe in 2000, what was it, 2012, when I graduated from my planning program. Those are the traditional means of connecting with people. So I'm very curious how you do things. Like, what are some of the things that, in addition to like kind of focusing from the few instead of the many, but yeah, what other like approaches is in there that you do that are different than, I think, what traditional urban planning, people with the urban planning credentials are familiar with?
And before you answer, Zahra, I do want to just note that, like, I think that your approach is actually kind of similar to Deqah's, because, like, she brought podcasting to bear, right? Like, part of this, like, you're talking about talking to a few people and going deep with them. Like, that's kind of why I think it's so neat that Deqah has incorporated podcasting as part of her community engagement process, essentially, when she's doing like preservation work. It's like learning from a few community leaders, their stories, and that impacts the way that you think about preserving a place.
Yeah.
So I do think that there's like an interesting connection there that I wanted to point out.
I feel like it's like learning about people that like makes it like really interesting, because you go into a community and you want to work with people, but you don't know their community, right? So it's like that first layer of let's get introduced. That's how I see it.
And stories are data, right? Like, I think this is also the thing, and I'm talking to storytellers here. I'm in a Zoom room or a Riverside room of storytellers, so I think I'm preaching to the choir. But I do think that when you talk about how it deviates from traditional planning, I think everything about this deviates from traditional planning. I now teach in a planning school, and it's how to talk to people. Like, it's like how to talk to humans in a human way, like how to not be scared of people, and I think the piece that is distinctly different in how we approach it is, and this is where sort of my design practice comes in, where we are not interested in the transaction of saying, we're building a building. What do you need in a building? That's not interesting. It's also very hard to answer. You ask me what I want in my community. I want, parks, affordable housing for everyone, good transit, so I don't have to use a car ever. Great. That doesn't help anyone. That's what so many people might say they want. So how do we get to nuance? When you let people tell their stories, when you give them space, you start to get to attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, right, that help shape why people engage and how they engage in the way that they do. But it also tells you sort of their attitudes about what it means to bridge across difference and coexist with people that are very different from them. And that can give you design considerations. Like, that can give you amazing design considerations. It can also, give you principles around, like I remember doing research when the Sidewalk Labs project was in town, when I met the colleague that sort of brought us all together, and remembering
Is that the lovely Crystal Dean?
That's the
Shout
lovely
out
Crystal
to her.
Dean, who brought us together. And I remember just, simple things, right? Like, people talk about, they're going on and on about their lived experience of using, parks and places that aren't their home, and they're chatting because we're asking them about their whole life. Where do you go? Instead of saying, we were working on a project about public realm design, and we said, so where do you go? Like, what do you like? What do you not like? People talked about sitting in the park, and you get a cup of coffee, and up here, a lot of people get a cup of coffee at Tim Hortons, and you sit down in the park, and like, you're sitting with a friend, and you want to like zip up your jacket, but where do you put your coffee? Because the bench is kind of curved. Like, where do you put down your coffee? Do you put it on the ground? Do you put it beside you? And and then in their comments, people say, no one's ever listening. No one's ever paying attention to these things. And you're like, oh, people want a coffee table. People want a side table on their public bench to just put their coffee down on. They didn't say that, but they were just like, oh, no one's actually thinking about what it's like to sit on a bench and like try and zip up your jacket and hold a coffee between your legs on a cold day. And like, and so you're just listening to the, I remember the story that's emblazoned in my mind is this young man, as part of that research, who, like, we were talking about, where do you go and what spaces do you like, that are not home or not work. And like, the image he texted us, because we were doing the research over WhatsApp, was just a picture of like a plastic blue chair in front of a Cinnabon. Do you guys have Cinnabon?
Yes.
Is that Canadian?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's in our malls.
It's universal.
Yes. I saw one in Dubai, so
Yes, okay. So it's truly universal. So like, it was a blue plastic chair in front of a Cinnabon. He's like, oh, best public space in my neighborhood. It's like, I can stay here a long time. It's safe. No one bothers me. It smells really nice. It's warm. I never have to share it. And like, what amazing principles. He was not talking about a public space. Like, it was a private space. And so I think part of the way in which we orient ourselves is to really think about people's full humanity and to think about their whole lived experience, and through letting people talk about themselves, because you guys are podcasters, people like to talk about themselves. Case in point, what's happening right here. And so, through giving people space, they give you the clues. Right. And if you're really good at it, you bring them back in and you say, did we get this right? And they're like, oh, my God, I can't believe you found that in what I said. That's totally what I was saying. So there's many steps, right, in the process.
So there's so many details to that story that I love, by the way. So, like, first of all, like, you just casually threw out, we were conducting the research via WhatsApp, which is like, love that, first of all, because it's totally a different paradigm for what research is. And I'm using air quotes here. But, like, I love that communication is part of the research, and you do it in the way that people communicate, which in this case happened to be WhatsApp. So I love that. I also just like that the way that the little detail about how it smells, I actually think is really important, because obviously, like, yeah, Cinnabon smells amazing, but like, that I think is just a little window into why it feels good as a human body to be in this place.
Yeah.
And obviously all the other things you mentioned, but that's just like paying attention to a sense of smell is actually a little thing that can have a huge impact. And I really like that you remember these details as the thing that allowed you to kind of like be embodied in that space and thinking from the perspective of someone in that community trying to enjoy a space.
Well, and that's part of the decoding, right? So Deqah asked, how is this different from traditional? You both asked, how is this different from traditional planning? Well, that kind of data doesn't get used in traditional planning processes. What do you do with the fact that someone likes the smell of a Cinnabon? And if you were to do a survey of 2,000 people, I'd guess you get a 98%. We like the smell of, like, who doesn't
Right.
like the smell of Cinnabon? And so, I think that we think these things are adjacent when they're right in the center of what we're doing. And so, we're working on a project with a post-secondary institution that's moving into a neighborhood that would have been identified as one of the priority neighborhoods in Toronto, sort of economically disadvantaged and underinvested in communities. And, so many people in this research have said, don't put a glass building here, put a nice building here, but when we walk inside, we want it to feel like this neighborhood. So what does that mean? It means the sounds, it means the smells, it means the textures. Like, it does not necessarily mean the kinds of programming space, and some of it is embedded in that, but some of it is around what does it feel to be of this community? Okay, so there's a huge Somali population there. What are the kinds of things that feel of them? And it sounds and it smells and it's those kinds of things. So for us, looking at the whole human experience and using that as inputs for spaces and places and neighborhoods, I think is so critically important. And they don't teach you that in school. Like, it is not, when we teach our class, my co-founder and I teach a class at the University of Toronto. And when we talk about this kind of stuff, people will hold us back after class and they're like, we do an evening seminar series on this, because no one is talking about this, how to talk to people.
It's crazy. Okay. I mean, I have a big question that I have on the top of mind, but I do want to let Deqah respond to that because I'm sure she can commiserate with you on that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, but I don't know. Maybe this isn't directly in response to the last thing you said, but I feel like I was just taking a note about the glass building in economically disadvantaged neighborhoods. Like, they don't want to see them. They want to basically have. So the word sense of place is used a lot in planning, but I feel like if people actually deconstructed the word or phrase, they would realize that essentially it encompasses a lot of what I've learned in historic preservation. So in our practice, there are 7 aspects that all deal with different areas. So some of the feeling component, the setting, the location, that's all really important because that sense of place, right? It's the sense of feel. It's do you feel connected to this place? And sometimes it's about the history in the area. Sometimes it's about the culture. Sometimes it's about both. In reality, I think also sense of place is about trying to make sure that especially when development's happening, that it's done in a way that people feel, the people in the community feel like it's a space that they can use. I think that particularly with the projects it sounds like that you're working on, there's an initiative or care that's being put in place there. I keep using the word place a lot, but there's just this I think more compassion to the work that you're able to do and the development that's happening. I'm impressed that they find opportunities to hire you to look into this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
we are too.
So that's where I'm coming from here. Is that's what's I think. And I know Vanessa has a question. I don't know if you wanna ask yours, and then we can kind of follow up with that concept of what I very much I think see as a hardship in America to try to do the type of work that you do, and I'm very curious about if there are differences and similarities between how people are accepting you in the work that you do in Canada versus if you were in America. But Vanessa, I think that you might have a question that would be something we want to tackle before we get there.
Well, it's very similar. It's like on this theme and thread. So I think maybe part of your answer might touch on what Deqah was talking about there. But so like this is a question I've been mulling over a lot, Zahra, because I've said this is like now becoming my line, but I'm like, if I ever write a book, it might be about this question of community engagement and how the hell you do it right. And not just from the perspective of community members and, as you rightly said, members of communities getting their voices meaningfully heard, but also from the perspective of development still happening, right? So this is like the sticky wicket is that a phrase? I think it is. This is the sticky wicket that I've been thinking about for a while now. And I recently, I have another podcast called Uncertain Things, and I recently spoke to someone very smart, very nice, but who said, I have become radicalized against community engagement. She lives in San Francisco, and she was like, not everything can be saved. We need housing. We need it now. Just start building housing. And if you ask anybody what they want, they're going to say, I don't want it. And like, that's not helpful. And I'm like so radicalized, just build, no community engagement at this point. And I was trying to push back on her. I'm like, I know there's so much need. I know there's so much need for housing and for affordability, but I have to believe that there's a way to do community engagement in a way that is meaningful and around getting to yes, not around just wielding no, because that's the only power you've been given. So I would just love to hear your thoughts on this.
There's so much to say about that, but I have to write down a few words so that I don't lose my train of thought because there's too much. So part of why people say no is because they're like, you're not listening. We talked about this. This happened in our community, and look where we are now, right? So like, there's a lot of baggage people bring into community engagement. And this is my fundamental issue. I'm not so far departed from the person you spoke to, where when people say people say all the time, people ask me to write about it, people ask me to talk about it, people ask me to reflect on community engagement, something like stirs in me in a bad way. Because I don't think that's the work I do, even though I think on the surface that's what it looks like. And I think I help people talk to people. I help people trust people, other people that are different from them. I help them see that like making decisions together is possible, and then identify what decisions they are going to make, because not all decisions are up for grabs. That's the other thing, right? Like that's the other, if I was going to go on my version of that rant, is that we don't go into conversations saying what is possible and what is not and why. And so, and maybe it's not possible just for now. Right? When we say it's not possible, we act like it's a forever thing. The thing that I think is a huge issue in how we develop is that whether it's a planner or a developer or an architect or a third party, quote unquote neutral, a third party that's facilitating community engagement, we almost never talk about how we got here. Maybe we talk about the history of the building, but we don't talk about why all of the conversations. Imagine if you were to open up an engagement session and were to say, we know that this community has had conversations about these 20 things in the last year. Here's what we learned. We went back and found all of those notes. And we're here to just have a conversation about where you're at. Because we've done our homework. We've actually showed up. Like, if you are a third party doing this work, show up informed. Like, not doing secondary research scans. And no, show up and like look at the conversations that have happened. How did they go? How did people feel? Was there pain associated with that? Was that pain ever, addressed or healed? Or like, some of that is like, it feels like this like hugging a cloud kind of work. Because like, what are the outcomes of that? But there's a stickiness to it, right? Where it's like, kind of people are sitting there and they go, all right, keep talking. Like you've got me. Like I'm here. So I think that's part of it. I think the other piece around, just to hot pursuit, that person you were speaking with that said build, build, build. I think we do need to build, build, build. We desperately need housing. Like we do need to build, build, build. But I also think part of my work is about who gets to build, because building generates prosperity, right? Like somebody gets wealthy from building. And so I think my issue with that is that we have to think of process as an outcome. And who gets to build the critical housing we need is going to generate economic prosperity for themselves, their families, and their communities, for a generation or two. So I think that in Canada, we're having that conversation, and we're doing a project in that space right now, because that is part of the rhetoric, is that we just need to start building. And I think it's important to just quickly pressure test who's benefiting from that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that the thing that feels tough is like the timeline question, right? Because there's so much urgency around building, and the type of work you're talking about is time intensive. Like kind of even what you were talking about earlier in the conversation, that like moving at the speed of trust, sometimes that's a slow speed. And so there's like this inherent tension there. And especially if you're a developer coming from a developer's mindset where time is money, you're not incentivized to move at the speed of trust.
But
right?
You're going to pay either way, right? Like that's the thing that we've learned. First, I think it's an orthodoxy. I think it's false that moving at the speed of trust means moving slowly. Sometimes it does. But I also think that I really, really buy into the Antoinette Carroll sort of equity-centered community design framework, which is like do 3 things before trying to collaborate on anything, right? Talk about why we're actually here and what we're really doing, right? So if you're a developer, out of your 6 goals, make one of them be deliver profit for our shareholders. People know, it's no secret, just say it. Brings down the temperature in the room when you just stop trying to ignore that critical part of your mission. 2 is acknowledge the history that got us to this point where this needed to be redeveloped and who felt harmed along the way. And 3, just get a sense of whoever's in the room, what assets or access to power they have. So do they know people? Do they have strong social networks? Okay, great. That's an amazing asset. Do they have money? That's an amazing asset. Recognize that everyone sitting at the table has a ton of power that they can bring. And that can be done quickly. Like that doesn't have to be days and weeks, but you do have to be comfortable saying, we know conversations have happened that haven't gone well. And we acknowledge that. Here's what we learned, we need to do better. And if you're a developer, that's amazing. That is like, breaking new ground in a lot of ways for this kind of work. So I really struggle when people say moving at the speed of trust takes time, because I've made some of my most dear friends on a walk. Like you're out, you meet someone, you go for a coffee and a walk, and you're like, I think I want to be your friend. And so it doesn't take, and you nurture and deepen that relationship, but the heart opens up, and then you deepen that trust over time as you do things together, right? And so I think you can still do together, but continuing that orientation, keeping an orientation to acknowledging everyone's humanity and looking at people's whole lives, allow them to show up and be themselves and, work in a way that's more human. So I think that's so many institutions say it sounds so good, but it's going to take so much time. Well, you know what? When communities rally against your project, it costs you a lot of money and it slows your project down. I've seen that happen a lot. And that goes to Deqah's question around how do you get to do this work? Well, often it's when people are like, we should have listened to you.
No, I know. I get that all the time. People are like, oh, I should listen to you. Or people listen to me and then they don't end up hiring me because they take that particular advice that I've given them and it solves their problem, because yes, I can give you a single sentence that will solve your problem sometimes. And it literally, and usually it's, did you talk to everybody involved and who needs to be involved? So I think we wanted to hopefully, if we're cool with it, shift gears a little bit from community engagement to more of inclusive development. Vanessa, would you like to kick it off? You want to ask the next question?
Yeah, we wanted to shift a little bit into this idea of inclusive development, which we've been working through. And as you know, I've been thinking about this for a little bit as well with my previous podcast as well. And I've been coming into contact with now Deqah's approach to preservation. And it's kind of opened up my eyes a lot to how much preservation actually has to do with development. And I was curious to get your take on the connection between inclusive development and preservation, especially when it comes to to thinking about the ways that different communities experience their neighborhoods.
That's a great question. I haven't actually thought a lot about preservation and inclusive development, but there's such a tether there, right? Like, I think preservation, okay, so this is a hot take, but I think preservation is like, in so many ways, it is the sort of the safety lock, or like whatever, like on windows and cars is like a child lock or something. It's like, it doesn't allow developers to go too far, right? Like, I actually think that's what's interesting, is that it's like, it slows folks down and it forces them to reflect on, and actually, now that you say it, I can't unsee it. Now I'm just quickly scanning all the projects I've worked on, and the ones that have actually had the greatest chance of success have had some aspect of preservation, a building, a site, something that's meaningful to some group, that has slowed down the process to make sure that it still holds the value. It can still hold that value. And projects that have slowed down have been when, like in a bad way, have been when organizations don't do that. So I think there's a really strong tether. I think the challenge, in the Canadian context, and I imagine you have it in the American context as well, is that the story of what should be preserved is a colonial story, right? So it's like, I think there's a real inherent tension in that. And I think for a lot of us who have worked sort of in this paradigm of community engagement and sort of working with what are supposed to be significant sites, need to continue to do better to recognize that the significance is young, at least in Canada. The significance is very young to a population that sort of benefited from, stealing land in many cases, or occupying land in some parts of our country. And so I think there's a tension there, in that one part of me wants to say, yeah, when there's, I think of a building right across the street from where I live, which is a stunning old, used to be an old hydro building that's been decommissioned. And it's a huge site, and it's right along our version of, it's called the West End Rail Path, but we're part of the Highline Network, it's a rail path. And there's so much potential on that site. And everyone's taking it a bit slower because, wow, like there's a beautiful old building on it. What community use can this have? Versus just looking at a ginormous site in the West End of Toronto that could be only condos. So there's more intentionality, but it sits in tension with, well, that hydro building, yes, the architect built 30 buildings in this community is a significant Toronto architect. And, if we go back 300 more years, is this still a significant building, right? And Canada's such a young country, so our context is a bit different. But
yeah, and on the flip side, when you have, because I feel like, there's also movements to preserve things that are less in that paradigm, and maybe like a local bodega or something like that, which may not have the architectural significance. And then there's kind of like get into conversations of what is worth preserving and why. And also, does preserving have to mean freezing something in time? And I think Deqah and I talk about that a lot. Like, yeah, preservation doesn't have to mean not touching something.
The community engagement aspect is just like probably more important, I think, when it comes to communities of color. And so when development does happen, and it ultimately will happen because there's needs for housing and we just don't have enough. And so sometimes even my city, I see a lot of really fast development happening around the university area because they're like, oh, this need is immediate. And even though, I know my neighbors are going out there and saying stuff about it that, they would like to see something differently and whatnot. It's those things we're not listened to, right? I think that's the hurdle that we come across, is that we don't feel like we're being listened to as people in this neighborhood. So that's where I see that through line between inclusive development and preservation. And I'm kind of curious, what is that connective tissue for you?
This is something I've been thinking a lot about lately, because part of what I love, right, if you go back to that Cinnabon story, is I love all of the rich data about that. It is not just about that chair. It is about that place. It is about that mall. It is about that food court. Like, these are sacred spaces. And Deqah, you're totally right, where especially for racialized communities, especially for communities that have experienced barriers, that have been the subject of marginalization, they haven't had access to the grand spaces, right? And so we make our own. And so sometimes those culturally significant places are strip malls. Sometimes they are food courts. A colleague wrote this beautiful piece around how we do not, we as designers and city builders, we need, especially downtowners, we need to not turn our noses up at the promise of the food court, right? Like, you go to lots of public spaces in Toronto, you go to the most grand public space outside City Hall, and at any given moment, unless there's a rally, there's 25 people there. And distributed across a huge space. You go to a food court at any time of day and it's packed. So I really think when we talk about preservation, I think you're so bang on in that this idea of neighborhood character to me is inherently racist, right? Every time preserving the character of the neighborhood signals to me that there is something discriminatory sitting under the surface that people don't want to say, because the character is typically the upper middle class, non-racialized status quo, right? So that's what we mean when we talk about neighborhood character. We want to keep upper middle class white people, or even just middle class white people, together and happy.
And that's the problem when we talk about architectural significance and we focus that preservation on architecture.
Totally. And then, so I think that's where, this connects back to all the amazing questions you've asked around community engagement, where for me, why the parts of my work that I love is the storytelling. You go and people say, oh, we used to go there every Saturday after the mosque, or we used to, people start telling their stories and you realize, oh, this, Cinnabon, this Manchu walk is incredibly important to many families. This was a gathering place after church or after the mosque, and it's actually kind of accessible, sort of comfortable. It's kind of nice for people. It's not elevated in the way that we talk about elevated in the downtown design context. But I think this is the era where we have to start recognizing that we have generations of diasporic communities who have now rooted in cities. And there are places of cultural significance that are third spaces. And we need to start talking to people and figuring out what those are, because that's when that people lose hope when they see their favorite their favorite Somali restaurant, their favorite restaurant in the local strip mall razed. And people didn't know that was the watering hole for every senior in their community. And so that's why, if we're going to talk about community engagement, that's why it matters, because there's no planning process that really truly captures that.
I'm sure you've seen the strip mall turn Somali mall, right? Those types of places, right? It's and that's how history, works in North America, right? We don't always have that, historic, from the 1800s community still living in this particular area. And if we did, it would, there's a lot to say about kind of all of that, because the way things in neighborhoods change by the people who live in them. So the culture changes. And then therefore, when you talk about historic preservation, we want to preserve the past. So we have the quote unquote 50-year rule. If building is historic aged, if it's 50 years or older. And then that does leave out strip malls sometimes, and then nowadays they're becoming more they're hitting that 50-year mark. So I think preservationists and people are starting to look at them as something more. But my point is that I think it's really, really cool that the reuse of spaces in that way is pretty important and impactful and really important to community. I think that you've really nailed that right there when you talked about that.
Well, hot pursuing you, so good stimuli.
So I think I know obviously maybe we'll have you back another time, because we could ask you a million more questions, but I do want to just finish being very cognizant that you've been very gracious to give us extra time. But I would like to finish with a question around that kind of diversifying the field itself of let's just say built environment, because I come with a developer perspective, Deqah comes from a preservationist and planner perspective. So let's just say the field of the built environment, people working in the built environment or place. I know you recently started a real estate development incubator called Future Builds that is kind of trying to do its part to help diversify the industry. So would you mind, just to help us conclude here, why is there a need? First of all, I mean, it's kind of obvious to us, but talk about the need and why programs like incubators are a way towards a solution.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. We're trying. It's a pilot. Canadians love pilots. So we'll see. Maybe I'll start with, it's a continuum, right? So to close the loop on all the things we've been talking about around community engagement, when you do good community engagement and professionals show up as kind, open-hearted, thoughtful humans, you start to signal to young people, and I've seen this happen over generations in my projects, because now I've been a practitioner for close to 20 years, so I've seen generations, sort of a generation close on my projects. And one of the things I've noticed is the projects that have the most intergenerational lift are the ones where we brought professionals in, experts on tap, not on top, like there to just say, I've got technical knowledge. What are your wants, wishes, and needs? Let's remix them and build a great building or community or whatever. What you see is that young people who aren't exposed to those career pathways start to be like, oh yeah, I know like a planner. It's like my friend, like when they're like 12, right? And they're living in maybe public housing, but yet like, there's a really established planner in the city who they have regular contact with through a community-based project. So like you start to shift those barriers. We've seen it across industries. It's such a great way of starting to make the future the past for young people who think these industries are inaccessible. Not everyone has that experience. And then you get to some point where you cobble together a career. For a lot of racialized folks, for a lot of immigrant families, real estate is really, really important. It's like the way you're told you're going to make money and be stable in this country. You just have to get a piece of real estate. You just have to get a piece of land. And, my co-founder and I, Kofi, had been talking to so many friends. We're like, I think we're early mid-career. Is that what we would say? Or like squarely mid-career? And so many of our friends and colleagues have said, oh yeah, like I would have gotten into real estate development if my family had money, or like, if I didn't have to do all these different things, or if I didn't have student loans, I totally would have gotten into it. Now there's this, at least in Canada, we are surrounded by a community of mid-career. So they've had a professional sort of pathway, whether it be in the trades or, as a marketer or in finance, or they've done something professionally. They have some kind of way of getting money. It might be they own a home and they could leverage it. They have parents who are aging, who own a home. They have friends and extended networks who are willing to invest with them. And there's a huge market opportunity in Canada. So legislation is starting to change where we can get what we call missing middle, 2, 3, 4, 5 units out of existing single family homes. So zoning's changing. There's so much market opportunity. Someone's going to take advantage. Our hope is that racialized folks who are mid-career, who are those people who said, if I didn't have student loans, I totally would have gotten into real estate. I would have bought a house and, turned into 3 units. So we're capturing those folks. We are way oversubscribed for this incubator program. That is a 5-month program, federally funded. It's 5 months long, and it emerged out of a piece of research that we did for a quasi-government group that looks at sort of the labor market. And the sort of things we learned were the process is opaque. It's not actually that complicated, but people sort of like wave their hands and make it seem like it's super complicated. Mentors and social networks are critical for success. So peers who are also doing it to pass trade secrets back and forth. How do you do this? How do you get a good roofer? How do you do this? But also like having a trusted network of trades that trust you and want to work on your projects. Access to financial capital matters, and true mentorship. And so our program responds to that and is starting to build a pipeline of mid-career professionals specifically interested in building this kind of housing that we need. Infill, 2 to 6, 2 to 8 unit residential developments.
The missing middle, since that's a part of this incubator, could you just explain for our audience, like very briefly, what that entails?
Yeah, I think it's sort of an issue across North American cities. In Canada, we call it the missing middle. We had, I think there's some stat like 80% of Toronto is zoned for single family homes, which sort of prevents us from getting density in areas outside of the downtown core. So essentially what we call the missing middle is starting to move legislation that would allow for these traditionally single family home zoned neighborhoods to have duplexes and triplexes and, slight gentle density is what a lot of people call it.
Yeah, thank you. Because I think that we talk about this a lot through the podcast, and sometimes I like to make sure that we're just reiterating for people and reminding them what things mean.
Yeah, and I should plug our conversation with Vishon Chakrabarty, because not only do we talk about a lot of interesting things around community preservation, we don't really talk to him about missing middle housing, but that's like his expertise, actually. So just plug him and PAU, his firm, doing great stuff there.
Cool.
I love this idea of this incubator. I hope that Canada picks up on this pilot and makes many more. And I hope a future iteration has a preservation element, and there's like an adaptive reuse incubator. Just gonna start getting your mind thinking about these things.
I love it.
But Zahra, thank you so much for your time. This was such a wonderful conversation, and hopefully we can do it again sometime.
Yes. I'd love that. I felt this the first way I met you both, but I could talk to you for hours and feel just like very elated around you, and also slightly sad that we're not in the same room.
Yes. But we shall make things happen.
But we shall be. I'm gonna stop recording.
Yes.
But
Vanessa should physically
let's make that happen. Let's gonna make that happen. Okay, thank you, Zahra.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to this Urban Roots episode, and many thanks to our guest, Zahra Ebrahim. Your hosts are me, Deqah Hussein-Wetzel, and Vanessa Quirk. This episode was edited and mixed by Connor Lynch.
You can find Urban Roots on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also follow us on Instagram at Urban Roots Culture, or if you ever need to send us a line and say hello or thanks or give us some feedback, you can email us at urbanrootspodcast@gmail.com.
If you want to know more about Urbanist Media, the nonprofit that produces Urban Roots, visit urbanistmedia.org.
And remember that we at Urbanist Media are currently fundraising until the end of the year. So if you can, please consider giving as much as you can to our GoFundMe campaign. Even if it is only, $1 or $5 or something, whatever it is. The more people who contribute, the more we can show that our work matters to folks out there. And that will really help.
And if you can't contribute monetarily, please give us a vote for the Anthem Community Voice Award. Links to all these things will be found in our episode notes.
I think that's it for our final episode of 2023. So, Deqah, want to hit the good people with our tagline?
Urban Roots, looking back so we can move forward.